Or the honourable member for Holt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm really here in this chamber tonight to talk about concerns that have been raised by my local taxi community, and that relates to the rise of a service called Uber and also its lack of compliance with Australian laws. Now, 5 years ago in San Francisco, this transportation service, Uber Transportation, was created by Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp. Uber aimed to use its application or app on a mobile phone to allow consumers with smartphones to submit an electronic booking request which would route to Uber drivers who use their own cars to provide a transportation service. From this concept 5 years ago, Uber is now available in 58 countries and 300 cities worldwide. It is increasingly popular with younger Australians after it set up its operations in Australia 3 years ago. And what I'm going to say is not going to be popular with young Australians, but young Australians need to be very concerned about services that are offered without appropriate workplace protections and legal protections which offer them protection when they use these services. I'm a huge supporter of new forms of innovation. However, innovation must be bound by workplace laws, occupational health and safety laws, laws that provide insurance and commercial protections for users. We have laws governing taxi services at present, and it's my contention that those same laws should govern Uber services as well. On the 6th of April, I met with representatives from Dandenong Taxis, led by Jasprit Haya. This group included Mr Nirmal Sekon, Charles Harrison, Ali Demirci, who are members of the local Afghan, Indian and Turkish communities. These leading figures from Dandenong Taxis drew their concerns about Uber to my attention. They drew a very powerful contrast with what regulations and laws they are subjected to versus what the providers of Uber services are required to meet. For example, the Australian taxi community operates legally under the Transportation Act. Additionally, it pays government licence fees up to $24,000, full taxi insurance of $5,000, work cover is paid for drivers, liability gap insurance is paid for passengers, and full taxi registration is paid, and that's roughly about $2,700 a year. The cab owners collect the GST, they submit BAS statements. Their vehicles have to be no older than 6.5 years. Registered taxi drivers provide disabled passenger support. Vehicle annual roadworthy checks have to be undertaken. Vehicle signage and decals are mandatory. Driver knowledge tests are undertaken. Driver police checks are undertaken. 0 or 0.0% blood alcohol readings for professional drivers are required. Cameras and vehicles are required. Fares are set by government and GPS tracking is mandatory for all cabs. Here's the contrast. The contrast with Uber services. This is what they're required. They're not legal under the Transportation Act. They actually operate illegally and they've been issued with cease and desist orders. They pay no licence fees to the government, pay no insurance for passengers, no work cover for passengers is required, no liability gap insurance is not required. It only pays the standard registration fees. It collects no GST, don't submit BAS statements, and only restricts vehicles to be no older than 10 years. Does not provide mandatorily disabled passenger support. There are no roadworthy checks that are required. It pays no signage fees. Uber drivers do not have to undertake a knowledge check or a test or a police check. They can have up to 0.05 blood alcohol limit, but they have no cameras required in their cars, fares are not set by the government, and there's no guarantee of GPS car tracking. Now, how on earth would anyone in this chamber say that that's a level playing field for our taxi drivers and taxi cab owners? As a Member of Parliament, I'm deeply focused on jobs, workplace security. I'm incredibly concerned about this new standard that's able to be used by Uber and its drivers because they're contractors, they're not employees. Many Australians enjoy renting out their room via Airbnb and driving their cars under Uber. But what we're starting to see and what we're hearing from across the country and around the world is, notwithstanding new employment opportunities that are rising, they're raising very, very hard questions about workplace protections and what employment conditions will look like in the future. Uber's classification as drivers as contractors means that the company is not responsible for all sorts of employment protections and conditions such as fair pay, sick leave, annual leave, paid parental leave, superannuation, car maintenance and much, much more. If all drivers were classified as employees, Uber would have to provide these conditions and protections as well as manage a workforce of more than 1 million people internationally. Uber drivers are not granted proper employment agreements as contractors to ensure their rights of work are protected. This is, in my mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, a dangerously deregulated environment. We have seen and heard examples of customers that have suffered abuse from Uber drivers. Customers have caught drivers texting whilst driving and have driven in cars that have encountered serious mechanical difficulties because they're not roadworthy. There's nobody to force them to be roadworthy. I'm advised that there are more than 1 million Australians that use Uber. It has 15,000 drivers, 4,500 in my own state of Victoria. So what I'm saying here is might not be popular with some of the younger users, but I make the point, and to people that might be looking for employment via Uber, why would you work in such a dangerous, deregulated environment? Why would you catch a service which is so deregulated? It's be like flying a plane, hopping on a plane that didn't have a commercially qualified pilot, which plane wasn't having to be subjected to airworthy checks, and if something happened, you'd be not covered by insurance. It's the same parallel as a form of transportation that requires you to go from point A to point B. And I think if more young people and people using these services were actually thinking about what they were doing and getting into these services, or even providing these services, they'd have second thoughts. Australian and my local taxi community, they strive to ensure, they're not perfect, but they strive to ensure customer safety. In most states, there are police checks on taxi drivers, mechanical checks, cameras, screens, GPS and emergency call buttons in their taxis. The taxi drivers that I talk to suggest that at the very least, even as a starting point, that Uber and New Zealand operations consider improving customer safety and ensure Uber drivers undergo police and accreditation checks, and that they check their vehicles. The consistent theme that has emerged in my consultation with consumers and taxi owners and drivers is that instead of standing up for working people, Uber just wishes to play outside the rules. Of course, Uber will gain an advantage if it's not appropriately regulated. It does. And it has been created in a way to provide less transparent and more cost-effective ways of providing this service, but the price is no safeguards and no protections for drivers and customers. If the same standards now apply to the Australian taxi community, which is what, if you're trying to reduce down the level playing field, then the taxi environment generally would be completely commercially unsafe, and we'd have to basically create a system that was really detrimental to everyone that would be using a taxi service. Uber makes the case apparently for taxi reform, but then doesn't want to play on a level playing field. Now, there may be some requirement for modernisation of taxi services, but not like this, not without the protections. And the key thing is that we have concerns by people that have bought in, that have invested. Their livelihoods are involved. There was one gentleman that I spoke to that was present at that meeting that had spent $500,000 buying a taxi plate. His future and his family's future were based on that investment, and that investment could basically be wiped off the map if Uber is allowed to continue to offer its services untrammelled in the way in which it has. And if they don't want to offer, the other thing that is of deep concern to a number of people as well is the issue of not paying GST. Uber does not want to pay GST, not wanting to pay their fair share of tax. It's been concerning to hear that Uber has taken the ATO to court over where either occasional drivers must register for the GST. Australians believe any company that operates in Australia and their employees like Uber drivers pay their fair share. So they're even attempting to avoid that particular commitment. So I think that it was a very compelling meeting, and I thank those that were present at that meeting on Thursday, a very serious meeting about the concerns that these taxi drivers have for this unregulated, deregulated, dangerous environment that's being offered by a $50 billion multinational company. I think we should have a meeting of transport ministers. We need to resolve these things. We need to regulate Uber so it doesn't continue to provide these dangerous and unsafe services in this country.